Welcome, everybody, to tonight's program, Autism in Neurodivergent World, created and presented by Florissa Center of Dixon, Illinois, and co-sponsored this evening by Mental Health America of Illinois, MHAI. My name is Dr. Kylan Bob. I will be your moderator today. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and on the board of directors for MHAI. At MHAI, our mission since 1909 has been to promote mental health and wellness, improve care and treatment for people impacted by mental and emotional disorders. We work with our peer organizations across the state to develop and support key legislative and policy positions on mental health topics and advocate for change and improve services. So each year we provide free community education programs such as this evening's presentation. A few housekeeping notes. Following the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. So it seems like several of you have utilized our Q&A option. If you have any questions, feel free to type it into that and at any time or ask them during the Q&A session at the end too. Tonight's program will be recorded and available to the attendees next week via the MHAI newsletter. If you'd like to receive our newsletter, where we share a lot of resources and program opportunities, simply follow the link that is shared in the chat or go to our website, mhai.org, and sign up. So tonight's program is presented by Laura Gumbiner from Florissa Pediatric Development Center. Wow, I'm totally stumbled over that sentence. Sorry about that. Florissa Pediatric Development Center is a comprehensive center for children with behavioral, developmental, social, and emotional needs and located in Dixon, Illinois. Dr. Gumbiner is a licensed clinical psychologist and nationally certified school psychologist. She earned her doctoral and master of science degree from Indiana University and her master of arts degree from Northwestern University, all with a focus on educational and counseling psychology. She completed her pre-doc internship in clinical and school psychology with the Illinois School Psychology Internship Consortium through Illinois State University and her 2-year postdoctoral residency in clinical psychology with Florissa Pediatric Developmental Center. She has extensive training in psychological assessment, diagnosis, treatment, and consultation, and currently conducts comprehensive educational, psychological, and neuropsychological evaluations. I'm very much looking forward to this. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Dr. Gumbiner.
Hello, everyone. Welcome tonight. I'm very glad to be here. I'm going to share my screen shortly. If folks would be willing to enter into the Q&A, anything right now that's really pressing on their mind that they're really hoping I'm going to cover, I'll scan it really quickly to see if there's a way to integrate it. Otherwise, we'll definitely do Q&A at the end, just like Dr. Bob said. Success on the screen share? Okay. Well, I guess now I can't see the Q&A. So if something pops up, Dr. Bob, you can just let me know. I'm happy for this time to be fluid, kind of back and forth. Okay, so welcome to Autism in a Neurodiverse World. This talk is intended to be a bit broad, kind of covering on our current understanding of autism and also positioning it within the context of the neurodiversity movement and providing some updated research as well as some language about how we're kind of thinking about the diagnosis within the field. Florissa is a TAPS site. So the Autism Program of Illinois has multiple sites around the state. We are one of them, one in Northern Illinois. And so they do provide us some funding and they are asking for everyone to fill out an evaluation at the end. If you would be so willing, they love to just hear feedback about any of the talks that we do. Just a super brief addition to information about Florissa. So we are part of a larger organization called Crider Services, and they service adults with developmental disabilities, formed in 1952. I'm not going to go through the whole timeline, but sort of within there in 2008, TAP brought sort of screening processes to Kreider to start to try to understand what was happening in this northern rural area of Illinois in terms of kids presenting with some features that may or may not be related to autism. So the services were brought to Kreider, but the children's division, which is Florissa, wasn't formed actually until 2014. So we've only been around for 10 years. We are in northern Illinois. And then those other times are 2017, 2020 are related to some other grant projects we've done. But now here in 2024, we're continuing to expand what we do. We service 14 counties, I think, 14 to 16 counties, all in northern Illinois, and most of them are fairly rural. Our mission is really to be an accessible system of care, and our logo has four, I guess they're flowers, like components to it, because there were four organizations that came together and wrote a HRSA grant to kind of fund us starting. We want to provide comprehensive diagnostic evaluations. We have a transdisciplinary approach because there's such a need in Northern Illinois. It's so rural. Folks were having to travel a couple of hours to get an evaluation, or the wait lists were just really long. And so the idea was to be able to provide something more locally. We do the psychological assessments for kids really between ages 3 up to 22, although we do see young ones as well who are younger than 3, so 2. We do have a transdisciplinary approach for specific types of evaluations, including the autism ones. That would include occupational therapy, speech therapy, and we also have a developmental pediatrician on our team. So we do also include complex medical situations. We provide direct therapy for individuals here at Florissa, particularly specializing in youth who have autism, who they or their families feel like they would benefit from some direct therapy. We have family events, sibling shops, which are activities for the siblings of an individual that has a neurodiverse diagnosis. We have a resource library for families to check out materials. We do presentations like this, and then we're also a training site. So we have graduate students here who are learning therapy or the psychological evaluation process. And we also have a doctoral student right now. She's not a student, a doctoral resident fellow. Anyway, okay, so that's a little bit about us. So let's dive into the autism components. So when we're thinking about a diagnosis of autism, that really stems from a medical model of thinking about an individual has a disability and we want to do something to cure it. That's the history of sort of how we've moved through the diagnostic world here in the West. And as you can see the picture showing, there's like this person in the middle of the circle with lots of arrows pointing at it, because the medical model is pretty individually based. It's sort of like there's something going on with the person. The person is kind of having the problem. And so we want to do something to either quote unquote fix the person or fix something to help their problem. And I do want to be really clear. I'm not making a statement like that's good or bad. I just want to present to you that this is really kind of the history of sort of how we approach diagnoses. In some ways, the medical model has been useful because it gives everyone a common language. It gives common diagnostic criteria so that we can all be sure we're kind of talking about the same thing. But in the framework of thinking about autism, it isn't necessarily helpful because it did stem from more allistic voices. And if you haven't heard that term, the term allistic would be a person who is not autistic. So someone who is autistic has autism, someone who is allistic is not. And historically, folks with autism, at least it hasn't been documented, haven't really been a part of thinking about what autism is, if it is a disability, and sort of what do we do about it. Again, just presenting a little bit of history there. But this is what we operate from diagnostically. And so when we think about autism, it's really helpful to know that the diagnosis is considered a neurologically based, it's a neurodevelopmental disorder. So that means that the presentation presents in the early developmental years or during the early developmental time period, that there is something neurologically different in individuals with autism compared to those without, and that there's a unique set of symptoms that kind of present in the individual. Neurologically, the limbic system is a little bit different. The amygdala processes emotions and reactions a little bit differently, and the cerebellum is different, which has a lot to do with regulation. Now, this is a really simplified version of the diagnostic criteria we're looking at, but essentially there's just two categories, which if you were to go online and search the internet, or you're kind of looking at social media videos, you're going to get like this long plethora of like Do you see these features? If you see these features, this might be autism, which it may or may not, but that's not really like what we're doing diagnostically. We're looking for features that would fit within kind of more specific categories. This kind of social communication, social interaction difference, and then these, I always think this one is such like a muddled area because there's so many things going on, but the restricted repetitive behaviors. If we were to look at those more specifically, and I don't intend to get super in depth here, but think about those two circles. If you kind of, let's see, the circles were like this, so we switched them this way. So the purple part at the top is all about that social communication, social interaction difference. And then the blue boxes at the bottom are the second criteria, which are all about the restricted repetitive behaviors. And just so you know, we are looking for features in those purple boxes in all three categories. An individual needs to show difficulties in all of them, but there's a wide range of what might kind of fit that profile. So things about the social reciprocity, the back and forth interactions of social dynamics. That second one is all about the use or not use of nonverbal communication. So no language at all, but sort of how an individual might use gestures to communicate or facial expressions or kind of body language or how they might read it on others. And that third one, kind of difficulties with developing, maintaining, or understanding social relationships. You can see they're all kind of broad categories, but an individual needs to show features in all three of the social communication piece. And then in the blue boxes, an individual actually only needs to show features in two of the four. And probably the common ones that you might see, I'm going to go backwards. So number 4 is where you see lots of features related to sensory things. So over or under sensitive. Some families will say they don't experience pain, or they're not reactive to temperature, or they're overreactive to temperature, or they're overreactive to sound. It's not the specific features we're looking at, but sort of like that broad category. The restricted interests, that can look like a lot of different things. It might just be that there's kind of a really intense passion, something that's really fascinating to the individual in a way that you might not expect compared to other kids. Number 2, you might see this insistence on sameness, a really hard time with change or changing a route or changing a routine, some difficulties with being flexible. And then the first one, because I've gone backwards here, this can be the stereotyped or repetitive. I feel like those words are really jargony, but it's almost like things that happen over and over. It might be in kind of a formal way or a scripted way or a way that feels very routine and repetitive, not like a fluid kind of natural sort of way of playing with an item or saying a phrase, for example. I'm just trying to give you a quick overview, but if you want more specifics on diagnostics, please do ask them in the Q&A. And then we're also looking at, this is again, just another visual. Those two circles in the middle are those two broad categories. We're looking at the social communication and interaction piece, and then we're looking at that restricted repetitive behavior piece. And then there's lots of other things that also go into the evaluation. So if you look up at the two blue boxes, you see language impairment, intellectual, well, it should say impairment. We're going to give a specifier and sort of what's happening with the individual. There's often very co-occurring features, which you see in the next blue boxes, some hyperactive behavior, maybe some aggressive behavior, maybe some anxious behavior, maybe not, but those are things we might look at in the evaluation. And then you can see the purple and the pink and the orange. There's all kinds of other medical and physiological things that it wouldn't be uncommon that they might be co-occurring. And so for our evaluations, at least, we always recommend they see our developmental pediatrician because they're going to look at they're going to do genetic testing. They're also going to look at the common things that the family might express concerns, like constipation or toileting, for example, sleep difficulties, for example. It's all very individualized, but a way of just getting a comprehensive picture for the family so that they know what to do moving forward. Okay. And last but not least, as I'm moving through diagnostics very quickly, you don't need to read these boxes, but you might hear these terms where people say, oh, my child is autistic, they're level 3. or my child has a level 1. That's not really terms that we use in the everyday population, but diagnostically, basically all we're saying is that it's the level of supports. What's the level of need? Now, the diagnosis itself, because it's neurodevelopmental, there's neurological difference compared to folks who don't. That means that it's essentially like a lifelong diagnosis. So you typically, most folks would meet criteria throughout life, but what it looks like and how it presents and the supports they would benefit from certainly will vary. And that has to do with how they're going to develop individually, what supports the environment has, what kind of interventions they've had. And so these levels in and of themselves will shift over time. Sometimes an individual might be at a level 1 or they might be at a level 3. I only say that so that if you hear this or you see some kind of paperwork come through, it gives you a little bit of context. It's just really referencing what is the child's current level of need or support. Okay, I want to just kind of circle back to one last thing before I move on. There are lots of myths about autism. Certainly, we can talk about those in Q&A. And part of that has to do with the history. You know, it wasn't actually a formal diagnosis within our diagnostic system until the 1980s, which is really not that long ago. And it's undergone a few shifts in the diagnostic criteria and what we're looking for, which is part of what I'm talking about tonight. Even I'm sure you've heard terms about high functioning or low functioning or Asperger's, or now it's a spectrum. And just that shift in thinking because of the development within the research. And also now folks who with autism are part of the conversation and are sharing their experiences has really helped us to just better understand what might be going on. There's a very famous quote from an autistic professor, actually, who says, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, meaning that each has their own kind of unique set of features. So I do want to talk about the language a little bit because there has been a drastic shift in the field over the last 40 years. Typically, when we say autism spectrum disorder, people are thinking of a linear spectrum, less autistic to more autistic. And you'll even hear folks say, well, my child has autism, but they're really high functioning, or my child kind of has the high functioning component. But we've learned that that actually really doesn't tell us much. It's not really giving us very much of a picture of the individual. And so we might think about it a little bit, maybe more like this. So like, what does their actual, the spectrum is sort of like, what are the presentations and how do they vary? The cognitive skills, they might have very gifted cognitive skills down to significantly impaired cognitive skills. They might be anywhere from non-speaking to extremely verbal, speaking in ways that are very advanced. Their social interactions, folks with autism, just because there's a communication difference or a social interaction difference doesn't at all mean that they don't want to interact or that they don't want relationships. And so their presentation socially can vary anywhere within that range from, you know, kind of seeming indifferent or aloof to extremely interactive. Motor skills often vary, right? Uncoordinated to very coordinated. Oftentimes occupational therapy or physical therapy are a component of the treatment should that be relevant to the child. Behavior can range from very rigid to, you know, some folks with autism can be very flexible or are very flexible. Same with sensory stuff. All right, I present this to you because this initial linear, like more or less autistic, it doesn't tell us much, right? We don't really know what the needs are. So we start to maybe think like this, but even these represents a very linear perspective of the child. And so the field has really shifted from thinking about autism from a linear perspective, a linear spectrum, to much more of a pie chart. And so if we were to think about those kind of like different areas, the motor skills, the cognitive skills, the language skills, the interaction skills, instead of those individual lines, we just put them in a pie, and then you fill in the pie depending on the level of need. Okay, and the needs really would be based off, you know, goals that the child has or that are going to be helping the child to be more successful with whatever it is that they want to do. And so this pie helps us actually tailor interventions better and also just better represent sort of where the child is. So we've really shifted away from thinking of the spectrum as linear, but much more of like a pie. So that kind of leads really nicely into the shift within our culture also of thinking about autism not so much from a medical model, but a little bit more from a social model. And again, I'm going to present this to you, not saying one is better than the other. And in fact, probably it would make more sense. We kind of need them all to go together. But the social model you can see here is very different from the medical model because it's not that there's something wrong, quote unquote, with the individual, but that there's actually more barriers in the individual's environment or society that are impacting them, that if we were to remove those or better support those, then the individual would actually probably function a little bit better. Autism is very much a language processing difference. It's a way of thinking differently about the world and seeing the world differently compared to people who don't have autism. It's not right or wrong or good or bad, but it is really hard if most of the world doesn't see the world in the way you do or process the information in the same way. And so that's very much a social barrier for individuals. This and that fits, it kind of actually stems from the neurodiversity movement. And so again, just to reiterate, the medical model is kind of criticized for, I suppose, from this framework as being very deficit based. You're saying there's something wrong, it's very deficit, there is something impaired. But the neurodivergent model, the more social model, would say that, neurologically, humans are diverse, just like other features that we use to describe people. Why wouldn't the brain develop a little bit differently in everyone? That there are unique abilities, and maybe it would be more helpful if we would recognize them. And that even though there's neurological differences, that doesn't necessarily have to mean good or bad. A sociologist out of Australia actually coined this term in the 90s. And, that kind of coincides with the boom of the internet and chat groups and whatnot, and folks being able to collaborate and connect and talk more around the world. So individuals with autism sort of kind of took on the term, and within the internet world really helped to grow the movement and to bring more awareness to it. And so you'll probably hear it. It's much more common now. And to think about neurodiversity is not even just related to autism, but just like variation in brain development and sort of what that means for the individual and from society. Now, you might notice also, side note, that most of the images I'm using for autism are the infinity symbol. And that's a newer kind of visual representation for the field. I think it was 2017. So I have to calculate 7 years, less than 10 years ago. Okay. And that was also stemmed from the autistic community saying that they didn't really want the puzzles so much anymore, because that kind of implies that they're puzzling and that there's something that you need to fit together to piece them together or to fit to fix. And the infinity is much more like infinite possibilities. You'll see it as a rainbow colors because that kind of just came out of Pride Day, the Autistic Pride Day, or you might see it in gold because the symbol for gold on the periodic table is capital A, lowercase u, which are the first two letters of autism. So those are things that you might see. And you can just tell that there's such a drastic change within the field. Now, no movement comes without criticism. So the neurodiversity focus, autism in a neurodiverse world, sounds very empowering, and it is, and very supportive, and it is, and certainly we want to think about it. But there are a significant number of families within the field who feel like they've been lost now because their kids really do have really significant needs, because they do need kind of more care where someone is with them, maybe not 24/7, but one-on-one care. And so they feel like their voices have been lost because they feel like if it wasn't a diagnosis, they wouldn't be able to get services or supports that their child could really benefit from. So there's really quite a conversation, even at like professional meetings. In the last couple of years, there's been some really heated participants in the audience who have stand up and felt very passionate about sort of where they stood within the neurodiverse framework. A few things to know about where the field is in terminology, if it's helpful, and you just have kids in your classroom or kids in your family or in your profession. I've already mentioned that we've really shifted away from using the term high functioning or low functioning and thinking much more about the pie chart. But much back to that kind of critique of neurodiversity, there's a new term that's been put forth called profound autism, not to be diagnostic, but to be a descriptor for the individuals who really do kind of need around the clock care, who do need assistance with things like toileting, who are non-speaking and not able to advocate for themselves. And so that was put forth in the literature, I think in just like 2 years ago, that maybe we have autism spectrum, but maybe we should describe this population. So basically, this is all to say we're trying to get away from language, but we're adding more language. So stay tuned. Another thing that you might hear is folks are saying, well, are we saying a person with autism, or are we saying that the person is autistic, or like, what should I do? At least in the mental health field, we used to always say the person with, because the person wasn't defined by the diagnosis. However, the autistic community has really started to embrace person first. I am an autistic person, because they feel like it's just part of who they are and they can't sort of separate the identity from themselves. And so really best practice would be is to just ask. Particularly if you're working with families, if you have them in your classroom or you're providing any kind of services, you can say, oh, I know your child has autism. Do you have a preference in terms of, she has autism or she's autistic? Kind of what do you use at your house? And then you just kind of go with that. Sometimes I will fluidly just go back and forth between the terms, just because they are both accepted, but some people might feel really strongly whomever you're working with. Another super interesting, well, I think it's interesting terminology. We have Autism Awareness Month, but actually it was just updated again just a couple of years ago to Autism Acceptance Month. And you might see a theme here that there's a lot around language, because the way that we speak about things affects how we think about them. And the way we speak and think about things affects like how we behave. And if there was this push to move from, you don't want to be just aware, like it's great to know, but to accept is to actually to know and to include. And families were really feeling like their child with autism, like it was great that people were starting to understand what autism is or isn't to provide more acceptance in the community, but they weren't really including their children. And they're finding that if we were to shift kind of in this level up from awareness to acceptance, that there would be more inclusion, and inclusion and belonging is shown just across the board for all kinds of people for greater outcomes. And so that's a big push within the field as well. Okay, I have lots of resources here around additional information about neurodiversity, if that's something you're particularly interested in. You can see this talk was much more about the neurodiversity movement within the neurodiverse world, but I do wonder if folks would prefer that we talk a little bit more about diagnostics, or what do we do to support people with autism if we've just gotten a diagnosis, for example. So I kind of rushed through it to leave a little bit more time to be responsive to the audience.
Well, thank you so much. That was so informative. And I think you really painted the picture of like the history and how it has changed over time, the way that we talk about autism, embrace autism. And I'm really grateful for the information that you shared. We do have a few questions from the audience. I'm going to try to make it as like fluid as possible, but a question did come up about how to encourage parents to get a diagnosis for their child and how to decrease stigma associated with maybe what autism is or even getting the diagnostic testing.
Can I just ask a context if this is in relation to a provider or like a teacher? Or
It says anonymous on my
yeah,
end,
okay.
so I think maybe a teacher.
Yeah, that's fair. No, that's fine. Actually, it doesn't matter. Or you could modify it however they wanted to say it. How could I encourage? So sometimes I always start with just talking about the things that you've observed, and particularly over time. So not just a one-off or one or two times, but if there's been, a few weeks or several months of noticing something, just kind of documenting those things. And then within the context of a more individual one-on-one meeting, saying, I've really been noticing X, Y, and Z. I don't actually know if it means anything or not for the child, but I do wonder what you've noticed. So just starting with that as a check-in, and then to say, and oftentimes you'll get more information. They might say, "Oh, we've never noticed that," which you might be like, "Oh, okay." And then you put it on their radar. Or they might say, "Yeah, I do. I didn't know. Like, I don't have any other kids," or I just didn't know. Maybe that's not a thing. Is that a thing? What do you think? And I know if this is the context of a school, sometimes educators are kind of leery because it's a teensy bit of a misconception, but if I bring it up, then the school will have to pay for the evaluation. And that's only true in the context of if the school is saying the child cannot come to school until they've had the evaluation, then that would put some legal requirements on the school. But if a teacher is kind of saying, "Hey, I've noticed these things. I wonder, like, what have you noticed at home?" And then there's a conversation. They might bring up, "Yeah, I've noticed this too," and say, "Okay, well, who I know some," and then you say, "I know some families have talked with providers, their doctors, some families have gone to the center, or here we have this flyer if you would like to find out more information," and kind of giving them a resource or a direction, but not necessarily saying, "I think you need to go do that," unless you feel comfortable and you have that relationship with them. I'd be curious, Dr. Bob, if you would add anything else.
I am wondering if you had any ideas on how to navigate like potential defensiveness from parents, like related to potential stigma, or maybe they're just not ready to go there. Like, how would you approach that?
Mhm. Well, I will tell you separately, but related. So my specialty is actually for kids who were exposed to substances in utero, particularly alcohol. And so then evaluating for a fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And that actually has a lot of co-occurring features with autism. And so usually families will come in related to that, questions about autism. And you might imagine that can be really difficult to talk about, and there can be a lot of stigma and pushback, like not feeling ready to do that. And that's okay. And so if a family is not ready, that's also okay. It's kind of about like planting a seed. And then at least you have a starting point so that you can circle back. And sometimes it's not about like getting a formal diagnosis, but it might be related to services because services could always start, particularly if it's the younger years. So I'm just going to say preschool, for example. You notice some language differences. Sometimes starting with language support or speech therapy is a good in because then the family might start to see some progress and they're building a little bit of rapport and trust. And then you can kind of build upon that and say, we really made good progress here, but we're not making progress here. And sometimes that's related to X, Y, and Z. We would really love to find out more. Or we kind of wonder, here's a few different ways we could find out more, which one might work for you, or what are your thoughts about each one, for example?
I really like that. I like that services can still start, and maybe that is a really good in. Like if they're not ready for the diagnosis, sometimes maybe some families are really leery of the label. Like they'll like, oh, I don't want to label my kid. But I really like that idea. Like, how do maybe we could just start with the services and maybe start with speech or occupational therapy or something.
Right, right. And even external, like outside services outside of school, let's say it's about regulation. A child's just really having time with either like kind of knowing where their body is in space or kind of being able to tend to regulate, or they're having some sensory reactions. Going to see an occupational therapist outside of school would work for any of those, and they don't have to have a specific diagnosis. And sometimes that will also help um, because they're a service provider who has experience working with different kind of kids. Sometimes families will be receptive to like, "Oh, is that what you see in other kids? Is my kid different? Is that this or that or whatnot?"
Ah, that's
Same
great.
with teacher. I mean, it just kind of all depends on the context.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I wonder if you think it will also be helpful if explaining what the diagnosis look like, or not the process of sometimes there's like, I don't know what this might entail. Does it require a lot of time? I don't know what I'm getting into. You think maybe explaining a little bit of what the process of what a diagnostic testing look like would be helpful for parents?
I mean, yes.
Mhm.
I think more information is good, but that's not always true for every family. Some families like it's too abstract sort of to know until they've gone through it. So sometimes I just try to gauge. what's the holdback? Or what are their questions? Maybe not the holdback, but what are their questions? If it is about the process, then yes, I would definitely want to talk about the process. If it is, well, this fear of like being labeled and having a stigma, sometimes that's the holdup, right? And so I would address that if that was more of the issue. Like, sometimes having a label is not helpful, and sometimes it does create stigma. But sometimes it also is extremely helpful because it puts a name to the things that you're seeing. It helps you know that you're not alone. It helps you connect to a community, and it also gives you a really clear direction for kind of knowing what services are recommended or what things might be really supportive for your child. And sometimes they just need to sit on that for a little while, and that's okay too.
Is there like a minimum age for testing?
Um, Well, the American Academy of Pediatrics is recommending that there's regular screening. And I don't recall offhand the specific months, but I think it's either 15 or 18 months. And then it's again, I think around 24 months. Don't quote me on those age ranges, but I know there's two different time points within the first years of life that there's regular screening that the AAP recommends. And if they screen us, like they're showing enough features, then it's recommended that a full evaluation is implemented. There's some literature that evaluations start as early as 18 months. We here at Florissa have seen kids during their second year of life. And there's mixed feelings about that between the different kinds of providers. So we have four psychologists, a speech and an OT, and one argument for that is that there is quite a bit of literature that the features presented at that age are pretty consistent throughout time. And also the earlier you start services, typically in general, there's more promising outcomes. But if you started at 2 versus 3,
Yeah,
yeah. And there are a lot of other developmental things happening, at 2. So sometimes there's more questions, and it's really just starting maybe speech services, for example, and
right. Like starting
bringing
to
back
monitor.
later. Yeah.
Yeah, like
Mhm.
monitoring symptoms. Yeah, I know the ages and stages questionnaires is probably one of the what pediatricians will use to start looking into. Uh,
Yeah. And the MChat, I think
mhm.
there's a few different iterations right now. Um, the MChat are age, I'm not sure. But yes, those screeners are specific to the autism symptoms, features.
Yeah.
Symptoms, medical model, features, social model, language, yes.
Yes, yes, language. How about let's see, there is a question about I think it's what percentage of mental health diagnoses go with autism. I'm wondering if that means prevalence rate and what is
Mm,
the most common co-occurring mental health diagnosis that goes with
hmm. Yes. Okay, so it is okay, so current prevalence rate, I don't know if that was the question, but I think it's around 1 in 36. So it's about 2 point something percentage. Somebody can calculate that really quickly across the population. It's closer to 3%, but I think it's still in the 2% range, which is higher than it used to be, of course. Um, Co-occurrence rates. So it's very common co-occurrence ADHD. And you might even find online if you were to kind of Google, or kind of if you were in some social media, um, capital A, lowercase u, capital DHD, like the AUDHD profile. That's not diagnostic, but that is like an online, there's a community that's kind of come together. Like they have the co-occurring features and what that might look like across ADHD and autism. And part of that thought is because both of those diagnoses are neurodevelopmental. It means they both present in the developmental years. They both have neurological components. And in fact, a lot of the neurological pieces are overlapping. So for example, the way the frontal lobe is developing has all to do with the executive functions, which I think of as like the executives of a business or the people in charge. Like your executive functions are kind of in charge of you. They help you regulate, essentially. And that's developing differently in folks with autism and with ADHD. So it's not surprising that there's kind of these similar features. Now, just because you have autism doesn't mean you have ADHD, vice versa, but it wouldn't be surprising. I don't want to put the rates out there because I don't know offhand, but I think it's like around 70% or something. Other co-occurring features. Um, so as individuals get older, depression and anxiety are pretty common. There's different thoughts about that. Some of it has to do with maybe the way the individual is being received or not in the world, and they may start to internalize some of that as they have developed more awareness kind of throughout life. And typically for therapy, that's why we would be seeing someone for autism, because they're kind of struggling with those internalizing features of depression or anxiety. I think OCD is also not necessarily uncommon, which can also be tricky because there's like OCD would have some compulsive behaviors, which can be tricky to look at because sometimes in autism there's repetitive behaviors. So you have to kind of distinguish those diagnostically.
Yeah, and I believe things will also change as they get older and into adulthood. There might be other co-occurring mental health diagnoses too, like additionally, like anxiety, depression, but perhaps substance use or other ways for them to cope and manage the stress that they may or may not feel. Yeah. I think Mariah had put, can you repeat the site you just referenced to? I don't remember
Hmm.
what it was.
Did I just reference like a website? Did I reference a website?
I believe so. Was it in
Yes, it was like I'm trying to find it. AUDHD. I just don't want to. I don't want
Oh,
to put the wrong
yes.
site in the chat.
Sorry. I I do not know if that's a website. I'm saying like online communities, chat communities
Oh,
might use that term.
yeah.
okay.
I think
Thank you.
that's a relatively new term, right?
Yes,
Avi.
yeah. And I'm glad you clarified that too.
Yeah. I think there's a couple. Well, let me touch on this one. Can you describe some age-appropriate sensory play that's other than sand, water, and paint that maybe teachers or other educators might be able to use?
Hmm. Well, when I think about sensory play for folks with autism, I think about what are their sensory needs. And so, do they tend to be sensory seeking or sensory avoiding? And if I were to kind of just put it in those two frames, that would help me know what might be helpful for them. And an individual doesn't have to be one or the other. They often can be both, but for different sensory things, right? So they might be sensory seeking of something oral. So you see them chewing, sucking, biting, but they might be sensory avoiding for touch or tactile. Maybe not all things, but maybe light touch is really bothersome. But they like really deep pressure touch. And so those kinds of things I actually would refer back to an occupational therapist because they would kind of, do a sensory evaluation and then I don't know how folks feel about this, but the lay term would be like to prescribe a sensory diet. So that might be, okay, if they're sensory seeking and they're seeking out movement or touch or something, then we might want them to engage in some really heavy work. So for example, they might wear a book bag with a bunch of not bricks, oh my goodness, a book bag with a bunch of books on their back as they kind of walk through the school day, because that is like really helpful. The deep weight and the pressure is regulating their sensory system, which is why they're seeking or avoiding in the first place. Their sensory system is either seeking more input or the input is too quickly stimulating, so they're kind of avoiding it. So the sensory play, I would say, would depend on which you're trying to target, as an example.
Hopefully that answers the question. And can you tell us a little bit more about maybe different resources that are available, like what kind of help is available for uh, young individuals, and then can you also touch on if there's resources available for adults as well?
I could certainly speak to young individuals. As a child psychologist, I might not have so much about adults. But so when we do evaluations and we provide the feedback to the family, it's a specific session where we talk about half results, half kind of recommendations, services, etc. But then, of course, we have them listed in the report. And usually one of the first ones we include is called the 100-day toolkit for newly diagnosed autism or the 100-day toolkit for behavior difficulties in autism. Both of those resources are downloadable and free. They are from Autism Speaks, a national organization. There's mixed feelings about them because they have historically provided funding for Cure for Autism, which if you have a social model approach, there's really nothing to cure other than society. But if you have a medical model approach, there's just historically different feelings about it. So I like to put that out there so folks are more informed. But the resources themselves are extremely helpful, and they're an excellent starting point for families, or if the behavior is kind of a concern, that could be for the classroom. Other services, I would say, would really depend if you were to think about the child within the context of the pie chart, would be based off their need. What is the level of need that they have? Do they need some communication supports? Then I would connect them with speech therapy or a communication assistance device. Do they need occupational supports? Are they having eating concerns or toileting concerns, or I'm thinking young kids right now because that's who we tend to see. But, as they get into school age, is it more about a social peer group and or a group of kids who have similar interests that they could be connected with? Those would be the starting points I would go to. Now, I guess no one's asked this, but I will comment on ABA. So applied behavior analysis is still considered a very evidence-based treatment or service for folks with autism. Again, there's lots of controversy, pros and cons. Many families have said it's been extremely helpful, and other families have said it's been extremely hurtful. And so I always want families to be fully informed that with a diagnosis of autism, they do qualify for the service, and it typically can come through the state. However, it's very important that the goals are always in a line with the individuals, if possible. And if it's a younger child, then you would want to make sure it's a goal that's going to help kind of their life functioning. So for example, it might be around eating or toileting or something like that. But that is something to consider as a family.
I guess I could speak to adult autism. Unfortunately, I don't feel like there's enough out there for adults, not in the way that there is available for children and children and adolescents. And so I think that's just still such a high need out there to get that resource available. And I do recommend, finding a therapist or psychologist to do specialize in autism in order to make sure that they get the support and help that they need. Uh, Sometimes referring them to certain resources and books, like some that would, Autism Speak also, have some stuff about adults, but of course there's some controversy there with that organization. There is a couple of books that I could think of is Ask and Tell. It's a green book that kind of explains the decision making process of should we disclose, should we not disclose, who would we would disclose to, what would the process be, how do we ask for accommodations, whether it's at school or college, graduate programs, or at work. So it's Dr. Gumbiner talks about that this is a lifelong experience, right? And so things kind of change as they get older, the individual gets older, and just depends on the person and what they're going through at that time. And having that support would be really helpful. But as for getting resources as an adult, I feel like this is an area that at least Illinois that we can improve upon.
I will add, as you were speaking, I realized we do have a new, I don't know if it's program. It started last year, but it's called the Young Adult Years, and it is for youth who have transitioned out of high school, but they're so it's kind of between 18 and 22, and it's called just the Young Adult Years, and they come once a week, and it's a group for them. It's like there is a curriculum, kind of like a social, dating and online and texting, but really they kind of lead the group, and it's more of like a social connection, peer connection group. And what, research is really interesting when allistic folks, so people without autism, communicate together, they kind of report understanding. And when autistic folks communicate together, they report understanding. But when allistic and autistic folks communicate, both report kind of misunderstanding each other. And if you think about it as, it is a processing difference. The way we see the world and think about the world is different. The language we use is different. It is really important to have those spaces where you have folks that get you, right? Where you feel like you belong. And so that is something that is new that we started here that I forgot about. But when you were talking, Dr. Bob, I was thinking, gosh, maybe that's kind of like why we have more online groups. Like you can find, your people.
Yeah,
Not
yeah.
that you always have to stick to that, but you want to feel like you're known, right? And that you understand
Right.
each other.
Yeah, definitely. That actually reminds me of something that I think public schools in Chicago, or at least the Chicago public school, they have a transition after high school. So if they're on an IEP, some schools would provide they'll keep them on and they'll do like a career training program with them.
Mhm.
So I definitely would talk to the schools if they're in it and talk about that transition process. But yeah, that
Yeah.
reminded me of that as well. Thank you.
Well, certainly if an individual has a diagnosis of autism, that is one thing that is legally provided is that you can typically qualify for extended school year. So up until you turn 22, and there is usually on the job kind of training with transition planning, which, when kids are really little, they're not necessarily thinking like that might be the benefit of going through the evaluation, but it might be something to tuck away.
Yeah.
Mm.
Um, let's see. I think this is another question for maybe adult. Like, does Florissa offer any diagnostic services for adults, or do you know of anyone relatively close to the Lee Ogle counties who would?
Oh, to the Lee Ogle counties. So for adults, we can only offer evaluations up until the age of 22. Because I think that's the legal requirements around the disability law. Who would provide diagnostic evaluations in Lee and Ogle County besides us? Nobody. Or for adults, I don't think there's any. Lee to Ogle. There are some, well, okay, so NIU at Northern Illinois University, they do have a diagnostic clinic that's partially a training site. So maybe that might be an option. And then of course, if you were to go into the suburbs, but not
Um,
regionally, yeah.
feel like this is like a shameless plug. This is not meant to be a shameless
Please do
plug.
it, yeah.
Oh my gosh, I feel so uncomfortable saying it. But our practice, if we need to edit this part out, please let me know. But like our practice, we're in Schaumburg and we do specialize in testing for adults. So maybe we could be of some support. I'm terrible with geography. I have no idea where Lee Ogle is. So I don't know if it's that kind of a drive.
Well, Dixon's in Lee County. That's Lee County. And one of our surrounding counties is Ogle County.
Okay.
But it would be
A
more,
little bit of a drive.
it would be a little bit actually towards the city,
Okay. Yeah.
north and east.
I guess we have maybe one more question. Time for one more question. I could combine these two. What do teachers say to parents that was misdiagnosed with autism as a child and now they don't trust the testing for the child will be correct?
Mm, yes. Certainly misdiagnosis happens or can happen. Without having more context. I might say something around, when an individual receives a diagnosis as a child, it is often based off of X, Y, and Z. Okay, so that depends, right? Did they get the diagnosis from a medical provider? If they did, that might just be parent report. Or that might even not be an actual diagnosis, but a code that they put in the medical note to say they talked about it, or that they're going to prescribe a medication. That happens a lot, and that can be really confusing for families. Maybe the diagnosis came from a psychologist, or maybe it was a mental health provider, but it wasn't an actual like testing evaluation. So there's like different contexts, right? So I might say, a diagnosis comes just with the information that's available at the time. And so maybe the child has developed differently. Maybe they're showing some things now that they weren't showing before. Maybe they're, maybe we've learned more in the field, and so we can evaluate it in a different way. And so there might be different ways you can kind of incorporate that information to present it as like, I'm sorry that happened. It also is very possible that we'll have more information this time, or we're doing it differently, or, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to go about it. I would also say that too, like research have changed. There's so many available more resources and information now. Research has really come a long way. So
Mhm.
hopefully we'll be able to provide more um, effective or helpful testing.
Yeah. And even if it was around autism specifically, I guess it would depend how old the child was now, because maybe it wasn't that long ago. But even within the field, I mean, kind of thinking about and understanding this particular, um, you know, feature is different than it was even 10 years ago.
Mhm.
Well, even the term is different. It changed in 2013. So,
Yes.
yeah.
Um, I think that's all the time that we have. Hopefully, we got to everybody's questions. Thank you for joining us this evening, and thank you, Dr. Gumbiner. You'll each receive a short survey via email. Please let us know what you thought about tonight's program and what other topics are of interest to you. Lastly, visit MHAI.org to learn more about mental health and take or share our free anonymous mental health tests and resources.